You feel guilty for having boundaries because your nervous system learned a rule that was never spoken out loud. The rule was this: connection is safer than self-respect. If you are the kind person, the flexible person, the easy person, you will not be abandoned. And when you finally set a boundary, your body does not interpret it as a healthy adult choice. Your body interprets it as a threat to belonging. That is why you can be completely right and still feel wrong. In this episode, I'm going to show you exactly why guilt shows up when you set boundaries, why it feels like you are hurting people even when you are protecting yourself, how guilt gets confused with empathy, and the one psychological shift that turns boundaries from a moral conflict into a calm decision you can actually follow through on. Because the goal is not to become colder. The goal is to become clean. And clean is what makes your nervous system relax. Let's name the experience. You finally say no. You finally ask for a basic standard. You finally stop over-explaining, stop rescuing, stop fixing, stop making it easy for someone to take more than they give. And then the guilt hits. Not a normal light guilt, a heavy guilt. The kind that makes you want to backtrack, soften it, add 10 paragraphs, add emojis, add reassurance, add a reason that makes them feel better, add a compromise that quietly deletes the boundary you just set. That impulse is not random. That impulse is your old attachment strategy trying to keep you safe. For some people, guilt is not a signal that you did something wrong. It is a signal that you did something new. And the first thing you need to understand is that boundary guilt is rarely about the boundary. It is about the story your nervous system attaches to the boundary. The story is, if I set limits, I will lose love. If I disappoint, I will be punished. If I take up space, I will be too much. If I stop managing other people's emotions, I will be rejected. That story can live inside you even if nobody says it now. Because your nervous system is not updated by facts alone. It is updated by repetition, by follow-through, by proof. So let's break this down with precision. There are a few main reasons people feel guilty for having boundaries, and each reason has a different cure. The first is conditioning. If you grew up in an environment where love was earned through performance, helpfulness, being agreeable, being mature, being low maintenance, being the one who understands, then boundaries feel like failing your role. Your identity became, I am safe when I am useful. So, the moment you stop being useful, you feel danger. You feel guilt. Not because you are immoral, but because your brain is reading a threat to your social survival. The second reason is that many people were trained to confuse boundaries with harm. If someone in your early life punished your needs, mocked your feelings, called you selfish, called you difficult, called you dramatic, then your brain built an association. Need equals conflict. Limit equals attack. No equals rejection. So when you say no as an adult, your body reacts as if you just started a war. You can be calm, polite, respectful, and still feel like you did something terrible. That is not your character. That is a nervous system memory. The third reason is relational imbalance. In some relationships, your lack of boundaries is part of the system. The relationship works because you overfunction. You anticipate, you soothe, you accommodate, you carry the emotional labor. When you set a boundary, you change the rules of the system. And systems resist change. Not always maliciously, sometimes automatically. The other person may respond with confusion, disappointment, distance, or pressure. And your guilt spikes because your nervous system interprets their discomfort as proof that you are doing something wrong. But here is the truth. Other people's discomfort is not the same as your wrongdoing. Discomfort is often the price of a healthier system. And the fourth reason is attachment fear. If you are anxious-leaning, you are more likely to experience boundaries as separation. Even the word boundary can feel like distance. Your nervous system may think, if I set a limit, I am pushing them away. And if I push them away, I will lose them. And if you are avoidant-leaning, boundaries can trigger guilt in a different way. You may feel guilty because you fear being seen as selfish, or because you fear being responsible for someone else's feelings, or because you fear conflict, and boundaries often create a moment of conflict or negotiation. So you avoid the boundary, or you set it and then retreat into silence, which then creates more guilt. Different styles, same core issue. Boundaries create a moment where you have to tolerate emotional discomfort without deleting yourself to make it go away. Now let's talk about the mistake most people make. They try to solve boundary guilt by thinking harder. They tell themselves, I shouldn't feel guilty. I have the right to say no. They recite affirmations. They explain it to themselves, and then they still feel guilty. Why? Because guilt is not only cognitive, it is physiological. Your body is reacting to a perceived relational threat. The cure is not more explanation. The cure is a new association built through calm repetition. So we need a cleaner definition. What is a boundary? A boundary is not a demand that someone changes. A boundary is a decision about what you will participate in. That is all. It is not control, it is self-governance. And guilt often shows up when you secretly believe your boundary is an attempt to control the other person. Because then you feel morally wrong, like you are manipulating, like you are forcing. But a true boundary is not a lever on someone else. It is a line inside you. For example, I will not continue a conversation when I'm being insulted. I will not stay in a relationship where repair is optional. I will not be available for last-minute plans. I will not keep giving full access to part-time behavior. Notice the structure. It is not, you must. It is, I will. That small shift changes everything because it puts you back in the correct seat. Your job is not to manage them. Your job is to manage your participation. Now, why does guilt still show up even when you set a clean boundary? Because guilt is often your system trying to keep you bonded through self-erasure. It is a very old strategy. If you think about childhood, many children survive by minimizing needs. They learn, if I ask for too much, I get punished or ignored. So they become the easy child, the mature child, the helper, the translator, the peacemaker. And later, as an adult, the moment you stop being that person, you feel guilt. Because guilt is the emotional alarm that says, return to the role, return to the strategy, return to what kept you safe. This is why boundary guilt feels urgent. It tries to make you undo the boundary immediately. It tries to make you send another message. It tries to make you smooth it over. It tries to make you over-explain. Because over-explaining is not clarity. Over-explaining is a nervous system strategy. It is you trying to buy safety. And here is the hard truth. When you over-explain, you teach your brain that boundaries are dangerous and require repair through performance. You teach yourself that you can only have boundaries if you pay for them with emotional labor. That is why guilt keeps coming back, because the pattern keeps being reinforced. So we need a new contract with yourself. The contract is, I can be kind without being easy. Kind means you do not demonize. Easy means you do not abandon yourself. Those are different. A lot of people think boundaries make them unkind. No, boundaries make your kindness real. Because kindness without boundaries becomes self-betrayal. And self-betrayal eventually becomes resentment. And resentment eventually becomes coldness. So, if you want to stay warm, you need structure. Structure is what protects warmth from turning into self-abandonment. Now, I want to give you a framework that will make this practical. When guilt shows up after a boundary, ask yourself this question: is this guilt a signal of harm or a signal of change? Harm guilt is when you violated your values. Change guilt is when you violated your conditioning. Most boundary guilt is change guilt. You did not hurt someone. You interrupted an old contract where your needs were optional. Your body feels unfamiliar because you were not used to being on your own side. So you label it guilt. But the deeper truth is, you are feeling the discomfort of self-loyalty. Self-loyalty has a sensation if you were trained to abandon yourself. It feels wrong at first, because your nervous system was trained to equate loyalty to yourself with danger. This is also why you can feel guilty even when the other person is clearly in the wrong. You can be dealing with inconsistency, disrespect, vagueness, emotional unavailability, and still feel guilty for asking for basic standards. That is a major diagnostic. If you feel guilty for wanting a stable bond, you are not too sensitive. You are conditioned to accept less. Now, let's connect this to attachment dynamics because this is where it gets real in relationships. In avoidant anxious pairings, the anxious system often carries the emotional labor. It initiates, clarifies, repairs, reassures, keeps the bond alive. And because it carries, it becomes responsible. Responsibility turns into guilt. So, when the anxious person finally says, "I'm not available for mixed signals. I'm not continuing this without repair. I'm not taking crumbs," the guilt hits because the anxious nervous system believes, if I stop managing this, it will collapse. And sometimes it will. But notice what that reveals. If your boundary collapses the entire dynamic, you were not in a bond. You were in a system that required you to overfunction. And the guilt is the system trying to recruit you back into the role. In avoidant-leaning people, guilt can look like a different thing. Some avoidant people feel guilty because they associate boundaries with rejection. They grew up in environments where needs became demands, or where closeness felt like pressure. So they learned to protect themselves through distance. When they set a boundary, they may feel guilty because they fear they are being selfish, or because they fear they are hurting someone, or because they fear being pulled into conflict. So they avoid boundaries until they explode, or they set them harshly, or they disappear. That creates more guilt because the boundary was not clean, it was reactive. So, avoidant guilt often comes from a lack of clean communication and from fear of being responsible for another person's feelings. The cure, in both cases, is the same principle. Boundaries must be calm and followed through. Not perfect, just consistent. Because consistency is what retrains the nervous system. Now let's talk about the number one reason boundaries fail. People set a boundary, but they do not follow through. And then they feel even more guilty because now they feel weak. They feel ashamed. They feel like they lied. So the key is not setting bigger boundaries. The key is setting boundaries you can actually hold. A boundary is only as strong as your follow-through. So instead of saying, "I will never tolerate this again," you choose something you can execute, something structural. For example, if someone is inconsistent and it triggers you, your boundary might be, "I will not do long emotional conversations without clear plans and follow-through." Or, "I will not respond immediately when I feel urgency." Or, "I will not keep access open if there is no repair." Those are boundaries you can actually do because they are about your behavior. Now, here is the sentence that ends a lot of boundary guilt. Other people's reaction is not my responsibility. My integrity is my responsibility. Read that carefully. This does not mean you become cruel. It means you stop confusing responsibility with control. If you feel responsible for their reaction, you will always manage yourself into silence. You will always soften yourself into self-betrayal, because you will prioritize their comfort over your truth. And then the guilt flips later. You feel guilty for abandoning yourself. This is the hidden trap. People who avoid guilt by not setting boundaries often end up living with a deeper guilt. The guilt of self-abandonment. The guilt of staying in dynamics that drain them. The guilt of letting life happen to them. So, we need to redefine what guilt means here. Guilt is not always a red light. Sometimes, guilt is withdrawal. Your brain is withdrawing from the old reward. The old reward was being liked, being needed, being approved, being the easy one. When you set a boundary, you remove the old reward, and your brain protests. It creates guilt. It creates doubt. It creates overthinking. It creates the urge to send the follow-up. That is withdrawal. So, what do you do in withdrawal? You do not negotiate with it. You do not obey it. You ride it. You regulate. You return to the decision. This is why boundaries are not a mindset. They are a practice. Now, I want to give you the most practical tool in this entire episode, because people need something they can do in the moment. When you set a boundary and guilt spikes, do not answer the guilt with words. Answer it with structure. Here is the structure. Step 1. Delay action when activated. If you feel urgency to backtrack, wait. Wait long enough for your body to cool, because urgency is not truth. Urgency is a body state. Step 2. Ask one grounding question. What value am I protecting by holding this boundary? Maybe the value is stability. Maybe it is respect. Maybe it is peace. Maybe it is health. Maybe it is dignity. Step 3. Choose one small behavior that proves the boundary is real. Not a dramatic gesture, a proof. For example, you do not send the extra paragraph. You do not pick up the call that comes with no repair. You do not respond to the bait. You keep your schedule. You close the loop by doing the thing you said you would do. That is how your nervous system learns that boundaries equal safety, not danger. Now let's address a subtle but important part. A lot of people feel guilty for having boundaries because they have a distorted definition of love. They think love is endurance. Love is flexibility. Love is sacrifice. Love is understanding. Love is giving people unlimited chances. Love is staying calm no matter what. That definition is how people get trapped. Real love includes limits. Real love includes repair. Real love includes reciprocity. Love that requires you to delete yourself is not love. It is attachment. And if you have been operating from attachment rather than love, boundaries will feel like betrayal. Because your attachment strategy is built on access at any cost. So the work is upgrading from attachment strategy to adult love. Adult love says, I can care about you and still require structure. Adult love says, I can empathize with your history and still refuse the pattern. Adult love says, I can be warm and still say no. Now, I want to talk about the phrase that creates instant clarity. Compassion is not compliance. If you remember one sentence, Remember that. You can understand someone's pain without living inside their pattern. You can understand why they are the way they are without volunteering to be harmed by it. And the guilt that tells you otherwise is not morality. It is conditioning. It is the old rule. My job is to make this work. Your job is not to make it work. Your job is to tell the truth with your behavior. Now, let's make this even more real. What does boundary guilt actually sound like in your mind? It often sounds like, I'm being mean, I'm being cold, I'm being too intense, I'm asking for too much, I should be more understanding. They have trauma, they are stressed, they are busy, they are avoidant, they are scared. And some of those things can be true, but here is the key. Stories are not the test. Patterns are the test. If someone repeatedly benefits from your flexibility while giving you instability, then your flexibility is not kindness. It is reinforcement. And reinforcement is the engine of repetition. So the real question becomes, what am I rewarding? If you reward inconsistency with full access, inconsistency continues. If you reward vagueness with intimacy, vagueness stays vague. If you reward disrespect with forgiveness without change, disrespect becomes normal. And then you feel guilty for the boundary because your brain thinks you are interrupting love. But you are not interrupting love. You are interrupting reinforcement. That is why boundaries feel so powerful. They change the reward schedule. And reward schedules are what run human behavior, including yours. This is where many people get stuck. They set a boundary, then the other person gives a small reaction, a warm message, a quick apology, a slight softening, and the guilt disappears because your nervous system gets relief. Relief becomes a reward. And then you reopen access. And then the pattern repeats. So here is a cleaner rule. Do not let relief make decisions for you. Relief is not evidence of change. Relief is a nervous system drop. Evidence of change is repeated behavior plus repair. That is the difference between a reset and a repair. Reset is charm plus forgetfulness. Repair is ownership plus change. If you have been trained to accept resets, boundaries will trigger guilt because boundaries require repair. They require reality. They require the other person to show up differently, or they lose access. That is a different world. Now, let's talk about what boundaries look like in communication, because people either go too soft or too harsh. Clean boundaries are short. They are specific. They are not emotional essays. They do not contain 10 reasons. They do not contain hidden begging. They do not contain a trial. They contain a standard and a consequence that you control. For example, I'm not available for hot and cold. If you want to continue, I need consistency and repair. If not, I'm stepping back. Or, I'm happy to talk when we can do it respectfully. If the conversation turns insulting, I will end it. Or, I'm not available for last-minute plans. If you want to see me, we plan ahead. Notice what is missing. No apology for having a standard. No debate. No convincing. Because you do not set boundaries to win agreement. You set boundaries to govern participation. Now, why do people feel guilty for that? Because they are used to negotiating their needs as if their needs require permission. That is the core pattern. If your needs feel like they require permission, boundaries will feel like a crime. So we shift the premise. You do not need permission to have a standard. You need the willingness to follow through. And follow through is what ends guilt long term. Because guilt stays high when your nervous system does not trust you. When you set boundaries and then break them, your body learns we cannot rely on you, so it stays hypervigilant. But when you set a small boundary and you hold it, your body learns we are protected. And then something strange happens. The guilt starts to drop. Not because you became heartless, because your nervous system now has a protector. You. That is what boundaries really build. They build internal safety. Now I want to address a fear people have. They think boundaries will make them lonely. They think boundaries will push everyone away. Here is the truth. Boundaries do remove some people. But those people were not compatible with your well-being. They were compatible with your lack of limits. And that is not the same thing. Boundaries do not make you lonely. Boundaries make your relationships more honest. They filter out dynamics where you have to perform to be kept. They create space for dynamics where you can be real and still be chosen. And if you are someone who has lived in a lot of unstable bonds, chosen can feel unfamiliar. Chosen can feel boring at first, because your nervous system was trained on intensity. But stable is not boring. Stable is safe. And safe is what lets you relax and become yourself. Now, let's give you the one psychological shift that ends most boundary guilt at the root. Here it is. Your boundary is not something you do to them. It is something you do for you. The moment you believe your boundary is an act against them, you will feel guilty. The moment you see your boundary as care for your future self, guilt becomes easier to tolerate. Because now you are not taking something away. You are preventing harm. You are preventing erosion. You are preventing the slow death of self-respect. So here is the thought to carry. I am not hurting them. I am ending my participation in what hurts me. That is what adult boundaries are. And if you want to go one level deeper, use this. Discomfort does not mean I did something wrong. Discomfort means I interrupted a pattern. And patterns fight back. Your own patterns fight back. Other people's patterns fight back. But if you stay steady, your nervous system updates. Now, I want to end by giving you a simple practice for the next week, because insight without repetition does not change the body. The practice is small. Every day, choose one micro boundary. Not a dramatic one, a micro one. Something like not answering immediately when you feel urgency, not over-explaining, not apologizing for a standard, saying, I can't today without adding a paragraph, ending a conversation when it turns disrespectful, protecting 1 hour of your time. And then, notice what happens. The guilt will rise. The guilt is the old alarm. You breathe. You delay. You let the wave pass, and you hold the line gently. Then you feel the reward. The reward is not external. The reward is internal peace. The reward is a nervous system that trusts you. And that is what changes your life. Because when you trust yourself, your life gets quieter. You stop scanning for permission. You stop negotiating with your own needs. You stop performing for closeness. You become someone who can love without losing yourself. That is the real freedom. And if you are listening and you have been feeling guilty for having boundaries, I want you to hear this clearly. Guilt is not always a warning. Sometimes it is a withdrawal symptom from self-abandonment. Let it pass. Hold your line. and let your nervous system learn a new rule. Connection is not safer than self-respect. Self-respect is what makes connection safe. Welcome to PsychBond. You're safe here.